In this conversation, I discuss how to reform a country's security sector with Chris Jagger. We discuss security sector reform from first principles, Gambian culture and society, how to rebuild social trust in a post-regime environment, civil-military relations, the importance of national ownership in international development projects, the psychology of security vetting, similarities between Kosovo and the Gambia, why Kosovars are wonderful security consultants, how to become confident among uncertainty, why mentors are important for those who work in security, and many more topics. And now a little about my guest. Chris Jagger is a special advisor to governments on security sector reform. He most recently headed an EU-backed project in the Gambia, where he led a multi-agency team of senior officials and international consultants to develop new policies and practices for the country's security. Chris has previously worked with NATO as Director of Maritime Security Reform. Chris also headed NATO-led security vetting projects in Kosovo. He also teaches courses on hybrid threats at the University of Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. You can discover more about his recent work in the Gambia, Project Trust, on YouTube. You can also connect with Chris on LinkedIn or follow him on Twitter at the handle @2CFX. That's the number 2, capital C, capital E, FFECTS. And now I bring you Chris Jagger. People in policy really want to make an impact, and our world needs them to succeed now more than ever. Why then, despite all our technology, are people in policy still siloed in clusters? Policy researchers lack a shared space to connect beyond their tanks. Their research struggles for attention on social media, where shallow content dominates. People in policy need their own platform, where they can connect and think outside the tank together. Welcome to Policy People. We are an online community that connects you with the people you need to succeed in policy and make a real impact on our world. And this is the Policy People Podcast. Rethinking Security Reform. I am here with Chris Jagger. Chris, welcome to the Policy People Podcast.
Hi.
I'm so very excited to have you on today, Chris. Your career has really run the gamut of all various kinds of security work. You've crossed over from policing to military defense to intelligence, and you've done both work within the UK and in multilateral institutions. And so there's so much you've done. You've got so much rich experience, but you're now specializing in security sector reform. So can you give us a little bit of an introduction as to what SSR, or security sector reform, is all about, and what is it that attracted you to this particular side of security work?
Okay, Liam, sure. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm not sure I was attracted to SSR. It's more of an issue of circumstance. I found myself working in SSR and then became attracted to it rather than seeking it out. My first experience was in Kosovo shortly after the war, working with the United Nations, but more recently in the Gambia. I was brought in to assist in an EU-funded project in Banjul, as security sector reform advisor to the presidency. But your other question, more in relation to what is security sector reform, it's about the process of bringing a country, a state, and its security sector into democratic principles. It's something that finds its origins in Western international policy, really, and it's a doctrinal process been developed over the years. It finds its roots in the Balkans and Africa. There's a few definitions. The UN have a definition, the EU have a definition. There's an organisation called DCAF, Democratic Control of Armed Forces, who are very well respected in the SSR domain, who have also developed much of the sort of conceptual side of what SSR is as a process. And it's evolved. We now have a set of principles that I think most people working in the SSR would agree with: operational effectiveness, good governance, freedom of information, accountability, oversight. It's about building the professionalism of the security forces, law enforcement agencies. It's about capacity and capability development. moving away from regime-centric security through to people-centric security, developing a whole-of-society approach to delivering safety and security. It's about bringing the security sector under civilian control. It's about human rights. It's about the relationships of the security sector with the public, with civil society groups, with the media, with government departments. This is a huge doctrinal process. And when we look at examples of SSR around the world, they've all been very different.
Sure.
In some countries, it's been near total. In others, it's been much more focused. Perhaps the final thing I would say on it is, and when we talk about SSR, I think it's important that people understand this isn't just about reforming the armed forces.
Okay, that's an important distinction then.
This is a whole of society process. Police, the military, the customs, the immigration, intelligence. In some countries, you may have a border agency. In others, it might be a multi-agency attempt. So this is a very broad subject. It's a very large, complicated area of work that requires a really broad range of expertise.
Yes, it seems that perhaps one risk that comes to mind, I'm sure you can speak to this, is the possibility for various security agencies to overlap in terms of their mandate. And if it's reforming, and if they are transforming their institutions, it seems like all the things you just mentioned there, it seems like they would have to be a tight-knit consensus underpinning the whole reform structure. Otherwise, it could sort of go off the rails. Is that a risk that a lot of SSR projects run into, is not maybe having a crystallized definition of what their particular definitions of even the security sector or reform may be in a particular context?
Well, I think that's a very poignant question. The delineation of responsibility between each of the security agencies isn't necessarily identical from country to country. If there is overlap, and quite often there can be, and not only in countries that are going through SSR, also in sophisticated democracies, there can be overlap. Sometimes that overlap is there through design, and it's to ensure that you've got best integration of expertise and resources. It may be that one institution can tackle an aspect of a challenge, but not so well another aspect. And that sort of multi-agency working requires an overlap of mandates sometimes. But there are also many examples of where the overlap can become problematic, and it's through a lack of design and a lack of thought, or perhaps competition between agencies. It really depends on the context and on the country and the situation. One of the baseline types of analysis in which you would need to achieve before you could begin the SSR process and design your security sector reform strategy is to first of all understand what current mandates look like, how they overlap, whether or not the delineation of responsibility is in line with what we would consider to be good practice. If there are any points of friction, why those points of friction exist. You would want to conduct that sort of analysis, and it could have a destabilizing effect to the project if you didn't have that understanding. And it may be that legislation needs to change, mandates need to change in order to create better delineation of responsibility. But behind that, there's a deeper assessment in which all of this would sit, which is an understanding of the security challenges in the country, in the region, the social dynamics, the political dynamics, possibly some aspects of history could be important. There's a broad analysis of society and how that country sits, especially if it's in a turbulent region, that you would need to build first. You would then build your security threat assessment that would give you your priorities, that would focus your resources and your attention for the foreseeable future. And that would then inform how you would prioritize the use of the security agencies and what sorts of agencies need to be resourced in which way.
It's very extensive and context specific, as you mentioned there. And I think that gives us a better understanding of the thought process behind how you get to the ground level, as it were, for thinking behind SSR. Chris, I can hear some bird life in the background there. It sort of has me recall that your most recent project was in the Gambia in West Africa. Is there a connection there? And also, could you perhaps give us a little bit of context between what transpired in the country over the last couple of decades? What was your experience like? Because it seems like you've taken a little bit of the Gambia home with you there. So.
I have. That's very observant of you. This is Albert and Victoria. And in Banjul, opposite my office, which was at State House, we have the Albert Market, named after Prince Albert, Prince Regent. And I couldn't resist the temptation but to bring a part of Gambia home with me. In fact, there are a few traditions that I brought into my life. My favourite one is making green tea attire, of which I spent many, many hours sat by the roadside being taught how to make attire. And the other was to bring these two wonderful canaries into my home, which reminds me of time in the Gambia.
Right. So can you tell us a bit about the tea? What is the process like?
Oh, it's a wonderful tradition. It's more than tea. It's about a sense of togetherness, which I think is something very unique to the Gambia. It's a way of socialising, really, and it's a process. Along with the tea comes the attire paraphernalia, of which there are many components. So there's a little plastic teapot that carries water. There's a metal teapot in which you boil the water. There's a coal burner stove. There are what look like shot glasses that you would use, in perhaps the West to shoot down vodka. But in this case, it's going to be green tea. There's then the tea itself, which is loose tea, usually from China. Lots of sugar. The process takes maybe 45 minutes before the first glass of attire is ready to be poured. And the final product, which if you ever have an opportunity to try it, you really must, is 50% tea and 50% thick froth. And the froth has this very strong sugary taste. And there are usually 3 stages to drinking attire. So the first one's very potent, high in caffeine, high in sugar. The second time round is known as the main course. Okay. It's slightly lighter. And then the third one is very, very sweet and very light. So a lot of Gambians will liken the process to a 3-course meal. And you'll sit together as friends, as colleagues, around the stove, brewing the attire. There's an attire master. It's quite a skilled thing to do. You have to pour the tea from great height and it shoots down in a beam into the glass and creates this froth. You then pass it between the glasses, which takes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes to cool down the tea. You then put it back into the pot, warm it up again. And this process is essential. If you don't follow it perfectly, you won't end up with attire. You'll end up with something that's undrinkable. And you might be sat there together for, an hour and a half doing this, talking, gossiping, discussing politics, whatever. It's a wonderful way of bringing people together.
That's fascinating. And it's great that you had the experience to have it firsthand there. I'm sure some of your attire sessions were, as you were sipping your tea there, you're probably discussing very serious things, I'm sure, but as well as some of lighthearted things as well. But could you tell us a little bit about the Gambia's situation in regards to the security sector? And
sure.
Who were you having a tie with, and what were you guys talking about? Like when you first arrived, how did you sort of take stock of the country's situation?
Let me say a few words about the Gambia, first of all, as a country. It has a very long, peaceful history, which is, I wouldn't say unique, and I'm not an expert of West African history, but I would say is relatively unusual and quite special. It gained independence in 1965. It used to be a British colony. The first presidency lasted for many years, I think close to 30 years. In fact, the first president, Sir Dawda, just passed away, I think 2.5 years ago, and I had the honour of attending his funeral in the National Assembly. It was the first state funeral that the country had ever had, of course. There are 5 main ethnic groups. There are, I think, approximately 10 ethnic groups in total. 90% Muslim, approximately 10% Christian. The population is about 2 million, fluctuates a little bit. And of course, the country itself is wrapped around the river, the Gambia, which is, runs from the West African coastline east inland. And the country itself is surrounded by Senegal. It's a very long, thin country. It's approximately 20 miles north of the river, 20 miles south of the river. It varies in places. And history tells a tale, which isn't entirely contested, but we can't be certain, that the border was drawn in accordance to the range of a colonial gunboat. And there are rumours that the gunboat would fire its cannon, and wherever the cannonball fell, that would be a marker. What we do know is that there was a dispute between the French colonial area Senegal and the Brits, The river was considered to be strategically important, and the consequence of negotiations through that dispute defined the border itself. So it's a very long, thin country. Beautiful coastline. Tourism is very popular and has been growing, especially since the fall of the previous dictator, Yahya Jammeh, who came into power in 1994 and was removed during the elections of 2016. We now have President Adama Barrow, and the next set of elections, the first elections after the fall of the regime, take place at the end of this year. So that's a bit of context. In terms of who was I drinking a tie with, sometimes the president's driver, sometimes Gambian friends, sometimes the national security advisor or the director of the intelligence agency. It's a leveling activity. It doesn't matter what your rank is or what your status. You'll sit together and drink a tie. And actually, we talk about diversity as being important in developing ideas and running teams. And I think it's something that Gambians are very good at, in integrating people from all walks of life into these sorts of discussions. I've often sat, as you suggested, drinking a tie, discussing quite serious issues. And the taxi driver who used to move me around would have points that would be well respected and well listened to, and he would be encouraged to participate in the discussion. This isn't a hierarchical society. Sure. In the way that perhaps we're used to in the West. They're very much together as a people, which is why I think they have such a peaceful history. Muslims will marry Christians, they will marry across tribes, they help each other. They have an incredible instinct for survival. If there's ever a problem and you're sat in the middle of it, within moments, any worries that you may have had will disappear, because you'll be surrounded by a team of people, including members of the public, that will dig straight in and solve whatever the problem is.
So that really paints, quite a nice, hopeful picture there for the Gambia. It sort of begs the question, what exactly was the damage done then to the security sector coming out of the previous regime? What were you there to change, or what was the mission, I suppose? Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I said at the beginning, SSR belongs to the circumstances of each country. It should be based upon a pretty deep spanning assessment of all elements of society, but also an understanding of the past and how the past can affect the future, and any problems that may have arisen in the past that could create legacy issues. So in the case of the Gambia, there was a Gambian-led SSR assessment conducted in 2017 under the direction of the president and under the leadership of my colleague and friend Mamudu Badji, who's the national security advisor. And he, together with a cross-governmental team, together with the support of a small number of international advisors, conducted a nationwide tour, interviewed many people, and developed their assessment. When you interview people, they will give you very different opinions of what the past looked like and what the role of the security sector was. This is an environment where there's very little data. There are no databases or very few databases that could have been researched. It's hard to do the assessment, but you must do it, and you must do it to the best of your effect.
Yeah.
So that's what they did, and that designed the priorities of the security sector reform. Of course, what then happens is you'll look for what might be termed as international good practice. What should a security sector look like? What are the common principles that ought to exist in legislation, in policy, in mandates, in operational practice to ensure human rights, good governance, operational effectiveness, so on and so forth? And that's where international advisors can come in. The EU fund a number of programs, of which my role was funded. The working assumption when I arrived was that elements of the security sector had been corrupted effectively by the former dictator, and he had either appointed or encouraged individuals to show blind loyalty to him. But that this was a relatively small number of individuals in the context of the full security services that demonstrated this level of loyalty to him. And that many of the abuses, many of the crimes, of which there are many, and the truth reconciliation process, the TRRC, has just concluded its activity. And perhaps we can speak about the TRRC in a moment. But they are trying to uncover the volume of crimes and having witnesses come forward to really articulate their experience of how the security services were abused. But it seems that most of the security sector managed to stay away from the worst of these activities.
Sure.
And of course, you're not dealing with a country that has come out of a conflict or, an internal civil war. There was no violence in the Gambia. So the security sector was used to intimidate opposition, political opposition. It was used to remove political opposition. It wasn't used as a force to suppress the public per se, although there are examples of where the security forces were used to suppress, protests and demonstrations. But really it was used as a tool by the former dictator to keep him in power and to deal with the challenges of opposition. One of the things that he would do to try and legitimize some of the actions that he would take was to use intelligence and to use his own group known as the Jongleurs, which was a sort of hand-picked group of soldiers as, in dramatic language, henchmen to do his dirty business. But it's important to remember that most Gambians didn't know what was happening. Or if they did, it was rumours, and that Yahya Jammeh appears to have been very concerned with maintaining a very positive public profile and not to be seen as a dictator, but to be seen as democratic. He was very concerned with the elections, and he would make a big point of that, the Gambia has the fairest elections anywhere in the world, and that international bodies had confirmed this. And, he was an amazing marketeer and propagandist. And he also did, in the eyes of many Gambians, many good things for the country. The reason why he came into power appears to be that there was, an assumption across the public that the former government was very corrupt. There was a lot of nepotism, and that this military regime that came in was removing that corruption. And they held the space open, the political space open for a short while to allow elections to take place. Yahya Jammeh won the elections. He managed to convince people to believe that, he was holding this position through normal democratic practices, that this was a country that exercised, human rights to the highest possible level. And it was only really in the later years that I think people began to realise just how many terrible things he had done. And perhaps some of the rumours became more fact-based. And there are a number of things that happened that led to his downfall. The final tipping point was that he grew increasingly paranoid and concerned for his own safety. He started to make some really radical, he'd always been pretty radical, but really radical decisions, including trying to create division between tribes. He was leaning and moving towards making the Gambia an Islamic state. There are rumours which have come up in the TRRC that he wanted to make the country a kingdom, and that he would become the first king of Gambia. But I think that the real thing that really toppled him was his attempt to create tribal division, and the Gambians would not tolerate that. They are absolutely together. And this was very fragile territory that he walked into. And I think this was the thing that caused him to become finally unpopular. But then again, we have to remember that when the current incumbent of the presidency won the elections, Yahya Jammeh still had close to 50% of the votes. So he was still a relatively popular person.
So it sounds like quite a controversial figure on the whole.
Yeah, extremely. I mean, he's someone that is subject to Hollywood movies and many books.
Sort of sets the stage then well for, I guess, what you just were talking about there, the TRRC, or the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, which is and Project Trust, which you personally lead. So, Chris, it seems like SSR, and perhaps you can put this in the broader picture of SSR globally, but it seems a lot of it is first looking back at the ghosts of the past and to try to heal some of those wounds before building out for the future. So it seems like we got a bit of an idea of how that played out in the Gambia. So is this generally the same process that plays out in other countries as well? How do you see trust building and looking at the past, as a way to go forward?
Trust isn't sold. And it takes time to build trust. And people will only trust when they see with their own eyes that behaviours have changed. So circumstances will lead to trust if behaviour is as it should be. In the case of the Gambia, the security forces weren't used against the public. There was no war. There are very few, there are examples, but if you compare it to perhaps some other countries, there's only a handful of examples of where the security forces were violent against the public. But they were. But on the whole, I think the public had a relatively close relationship with the security services. But there were elements within the security services that were feared. So the National Intelligence Agency, as it was known now, State Intelligence Service, that agency certainly had a reputation of one that the public would not want to engage in business with. But again, it was also used by the public to resolve, personal disputes and financial disputes between people. So, I think most Gambians didn't necessarily feel on a day-to-day basis or even a month-to-month basis much oppression from the security forces. What they would have felt was a lack of freedom of speech. If you had spoken badly about the regime, if you had spoken badly about Yahya Jammeh, there was a perception that someone would come knocking on your door and attempt to correct your thinking at a minimum. I suspect that the perception is worse than the reality, but certainly it depends on what walk of life you're in. If you're a government official, it was a pretty dangerous place to be. If you didn't show loyalty, if you got in the regime's way, there's a fair amount of evidence that's come from the TRRC that suggests that the world will become a very dangerous place for you. If you're a successful business person, there's a risk that the regime would want to take that business. If you're a normal member of the public, perhaps you wouldn't experience or sense these things. Remember that tourism has always been important to the Gambia. So a perception of safety and security has always been critical to their economy.
And so is it about sort of weeding out the bad eggs or those people that have been corrupted by the regime, of a lot of people being simply put behind bars? Or is it that a lot of the people, now that the former president is in exile, that they've reformed themselves? I mean, how systemic or how much of a problem were those small select group of individuals around him? And how has the reform process dealt, with those individuals?
Well, there are different ways of looking at this question. If you look at it in terms of the last 3-4 years,
yes,
there's very little evidence, based upon my observation, that of my colleagues, that of the Gambians, that anyone that may have been left over from the former regime is creating instability, undermining the existing regime. There's very little evidence of the security forces since Yahya Jammeh having left of using aggressive means against the public. They appear to be fairly well reformed in terms of their attitude and their outlook and their togetherness with the public. I suspect that there is a fairly high level of trust. I'm not sure that sophisticated surveys have been conducted to properly determine that level of trust. But in terms of the TRRC, which is another way of looking at the question, it is necessary to investigate the past. It is necessary to bring people to justice, to hold them to account in order to build trust for the future, in order to build respect for the existing government, and also to heal. Now, the TRRC is not a traditional court of law, although it is empowered with some pretty high-level powers. But it's not a traditional criminal investigation. It's a process where witnesses are being brought, invited to the TRRC to give statements, but they're not being cross-examined. There's a lead counsel that will lead the interview, but there isn't a defence and a prosecution. So victims and perpetrators of crimes have given evidence. There is a possibility that some of those who have been honest and admitted to the crimes that they committed will be shown amnesty, maybe not. The decision of the TRRC, or that actually it will be a series of recommendations that will be made. And some of those recommendations will be to conduct new investigations of a more traditional criminal sense. Some will be to bring certain individuals to account already because they feel that they have enough evidence. Some of the recommendations will be to reform aspects of the security sector and how to specifically reform to avoid these sorts of mistakes, these sorts of crimes, sort of abuse from happening again. And some of the recommendations will be to do with the victims, how to help those victims. So in some cases, the TRC has brought the perpetrator and the victim together. An apology has been made, and an acceptance that apology has been made. And the hope is that this process will help heal the country. And just hearing the truth is supposed to be a healing process. Is it working? Time will tell. It's been well designed. It's based upon the experience of elsewhere in Africa. The process is certainly well respected in the Gambia by the international community, by the Gambians themselves. It's been very well followed. It's live. It was live on radio and on TV, on YouTube. It's very much part of national talk. If you stop by the side of the road and talk to a random person, they will have an opinion on the TRC and they will know what's been happening. And my sense, based upon conversations that I've had with my own team and my own friends in the Gambia, is that the process is helping heal the country. But I think this is an answer that belongs to the future. We won't fully know how successful it's been. And politics could change things. The elections in December, let's see what comes from there. Let's see what action is actually taken from their recommendations, especially in regard to the reform of the security sector. Like I said, I think trust is built on evidence, not on something that you sell to people, and that takes time. And then finally, the other aspects of how another angle in which you look at the question is what proactive action can be taken immediately to build trust and to root out the rotten apples. And that's actually a project that falls within my domain. And there are different components beyond mine, but one of the projects that I was managing was to establish the country's first security vetting agency.
Yes. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Like, how exactly does that work on the back end? Because in that case, you're preventing against this sort of corruption happening again in the future, as good and as positive as the reconciliation process is. So let us in a little there, Chris. Okay. What's that all about?
All right. Well, vetting was something that I had to undergo at the start of my career. I then became a vetter or director of a vetting agency in Kosovo. I set up Kosovo's first vetting agency, which was a project under NATO. And we vetted the Kosovo Security Force, intelligence agencies, senior officials in the security community, and then handed over the agency to the Kosovars, who have now been running this agency for the last 15 years quite successfully. And actually, this is why I was brought into the Gambia, first of all. So Gambia doesn't have a vetting system. There's a very basic process that exists within the security sector of checking out new employees, but it really was very basic. Basically, it's just a criminal record check and an identity check. But vetting is a very deep process of looking into someone's past. And you'll do that with as many sources of information as possible. The vettee, the individual that's being vetted, is aware of the process. And much of the information comes from them, either in the form of documentation, bank account statements, registration certificates for a business that you may have owned, your education there are many different documents that we would collect. Also, information from government databases, from private sector databases, such as the banks. And depending on the position that the vettee is expected to be employed in, depends on the depth in which these inquiries will be made.
Do you talk to family members or friends?
Sometimes. Yeah. So there are 3 levels of vetting usually. The highest level of vetting belongs to high-risk positions where the candidate, the vettee, will have access to state secrets, sensitive assets, a high level of influence. Usually these are intelligence-related roles, or senior positions across government. Then the next level, level 2, is also for people that have access to secret information and perhaps secret assets and influence, but not the same level of risk. And then the lowest level, level 1, this is for your normal police officer, your normal soldier. And each level defines the amount of research and analysis that you do. So at level 3, just as a brief insight, you would interview the vettee, and that interview may last for several hours. and you would talk to them about, their childhood memories through to what was happening yesterday. And it's a very wide-ranging interview, and it's more of a conversation than an interview. And the vettie would be well prepared for that conversation. They would have a good idea of the sorts of topics that are being covered. What you'd be looking to do is identify any vulnerabilities in that person's past that could be exploited by some sort of an adversary, or that the individual themselves may be a security challenge or security threat.
So those are two distinct possibilities.
Yeah, either the individual themselves is going to actively undermine you, or because of the person's circumstances, they themselves are vulnerable to approach from an organised crime group, a foreign intelligence agency, a colleague that's been investigated internally for corruption, whatever. There's a whole range of different scenarios.
I suppose it would be very unfortunate to have to say no to someone if, you could say they're true of heart and have no bad intentions. However, they may have something in their family or something going on in their background which exposes them to that kind of risk. How do you make those kinds of judgments? Is it clearly, if the risk is there for them to be exploited in some way or taken advantage of, then that's it? Or is it like a strike system, three strikes and you're out kind of thing? Or, to what extent could we say, well, yes, this person has a vulnerability, but based on their character and their integrity, it is highly unlikely that they will be corrupted or be taken advantage of in that regard. Just sort of putting ideas out there. I imagine there are some gray zones. How do you think about those?
Well, Liam, I think you should become a vetting officer.
Oh, thanks.
Because half of the art to doing vetting well is understanding those sorts of issues and knowing what questions to ask. And you're right in a key word that you used, which is judgment, rather than a black and white decision. It ought to be a judgment-based process. So, vetting in its simplest definition is it's a process of assessing vulnerability, identifying associated risks, and then making a judgment as to whether or not that person is suitable for employment in the position that they've applied for. So it might be that you identify vulnerability and a risk that can be managed, and that, most people will have some sort of vulnerability, which may or may not be their own fault, could be circumstance. But it's a vulnerability that is so low risk that either it doesn't need to be managed or it can be managed. A management might mean not putting them into a job that makes them vulnerable. It might mean talking to the vettie and saying to them that, you need to avoid this, or if this happens, come and talk to us. So honesty in the vetting process is critical to its success. If the vettie doesn't trust the vetting officers and they're not willing to be open, then it's difficult for the vetting process to help them. But when a vetting process is done well, it will uncover the issues, even if not from the vettie themselves. It will do it through its research process, which can involve interviewing family members, neighbours, former employers, anyone that the vetting agency deems necessary in order to make the assessment. That level of intrusiveness would only take place if it was a very high-risk position. So for the majority of people working in the armed forces, these sorts of checks wouldn't be undertaken.
Yeah, but I've an interesting hypothetical. I suppose when the vettie goes into the process, do they know roughly what kinds of things would basically rule them out of being eligible for that position? Because I imagine some people might think, I don't know, I smoked some pot, or I got involved with some gangs, in my youth 15 years ago. Maybe I shouldn't mention that. They'll self-censor and get guarded, thinking that will make them uneligible. But actually, that's not as serious a vulnerability as you just mentioned there. But if they know that, then they'd be more open. I guess you know what I mean? Is there some sort of a guide for a vettie to know that you're safe to share these things with us? Or is it just you need to open up and share everything with us if you're going to move forward with this process, with this application?
No, absolutely. I mean, the way in which you communicate to the vettie before they're vetted is multifaceted. And, we haven't started vetting in Gambia. The vetting bill is being gazetted, I believe, this week or next week. And it will be presented to the National Assembly. And once the bill is passed, the plan will come to life. But within the plan, as we had in Kosovo, is a period where you prepare the vettees. And it's done in many different ways. So leaders of institutions will be expected to stand up and give lectures on the vetting, and they will lead through example. They will be the first to be vetted. There will be brochures handed out explaining why the vetting is necessary, some of the basic characteristics of the vetting, possibly some examples of definite fails. But as I mentioned at the start, it's a case-by-case process that requires judgment. But one of the things that will eliminate you are, issues such as blatant lying. But even then, it depends on why the person's lied, and they may be given a second chance to explain themselves. And there are many different scenarios in why that might be important. Certain levels of criminal offence, especially if they have been, unprosecuted, if they're unknown to the state. If you tell me that you've just murdered someone and that the police don't know about it, then I'm going to tell the police and ask them to start an investigation. But if you tell me that you've got 100 parking tickets and you often speed but you stopped, or that you smoke pot when you were a student but you don't do that anymore, then all of these things would be relevant factors in the assessment. And I would be asking, why was he or she doing this? What sort of group of people did they belong to? Is that group something to be concerned about? Is this normal for the culture, for the context in which this person was living? What does the law say in this particular country about these sorts of issues? There is a legal aspect, and there are some legal thresholds that the vetting agency would have to follow that are unique to each country, depending on the seriousness of offence. And all of that would be taken into account. But the benefit of doubt in the systems of vetting that I create are to the advantage of the vettee. And I'm of the view that it is the role of the vetting officers to work hard to develop their evidence to prove that someone is a vulnerability. And if those risks can't be managed, then it's necessary to, fail them. But if it's difficult to prove and it's based on supposition or loose information, then my leaning is generally towards the benefit of the vettee and to risk manage the process. There are so many different scenarios, it's difficult to be specific about that. But many times it would be about talking to the vettee and assessing whether or not they're willing to participate in the risk management. But thankfully, most of the time, people come out as green flags, and they're either green or red. In Kosovo, we did get rid of quite a few bad apples, and that really helped build trust. And all of the green flags then are proud of what they've been through, and they're proud that the institution that they belong to has had these bad apples removed, and they will then enforce good standards. It becomes a deterrent and a motivator to encouraging good behaviour. And of course, once you have a vetting agency and once people have been vetted, they then have someone to report their concerns to that they trust.
This is fascinating stuff, Chris. This is I didn't think about the after effects of it. Of course, once you've gone through it, I'm sort of just thinking to myself, what would I feel like as a vettee going into it? Oh, I might be a bit nervous about this, that, or the other thing. But if you come out the other side and, as you say, you're a green flag, you're going to feel more a part of the team. It's kind of an initiation.
You do, absolutely. And then you find that you get very high quality information about people that are misbehaving. Whereas in the first wave of vetting, it can be very difficult proving things. But once you've got a cohort of people that have been vetted, they themselves become, a deterrent to others for misbehaving. And also your vetting picture improves. So the process that I'm describing is a bit like one where you take a snapshot of someone's past and you have a picture. You then assess whether or not there are vulnerabilities in that picture. If the person comes to the end of the process and it's a green or an amber with risk management, there's then a review, and you trust the picture and you trust the individual, and you no longer doubt their security vulnerabilities, and you employ them as a trusted individual. But there will be a review, and the review could be at any moment. I mean, because you're dealing with large numbers of people, there's usually a process that's been established every 6 months, every year, every 5 years, whatever it might be. But you can also have ad hoc reviews. You can have reviews that are triggered by a concern or by some sort of an incident. And if the second picture has changed, then it's now down to the vettee to provide very strong justification and evidence as to why the picture has changed. It's not down to me anymore to prove my argument. The tables turn. But let me put that into a concrete example.
Yes, please.
I process you, Liam. Hopefully you won't be nervous. We'll make you feel comfortable and at home. You'll tell me about all the skeletons in your cupboard and all the good things that you've done in your life. I come to the assessment that you're a green and you pass your vetting. You're employed within the intelligence agency as the top spy of Taiwan. But then in a year's time, we do a review and there's a Mercedes on your driveway. And the financial picture that we collected that you shared with us in stage 1 is one that wouldn't justify or explain where that Mercedes came from. Now, if you can't prove to me where your source of income came from and that it was through legitimate means, I don't have to explain to you why you're out and why you've lost your security clearance and why you're dismissed from employment. So it becomes a very powerful process over time and it polices itself over time.
Self-sustaining system.
My own style, which is subject to a separate podcast probably, is to put trust in the vettee and that there should be a certain amount of leniency in that sense, unless you can find proper facts, almost of evidential quality, to justify giving them a red flag. I have always tried to run these vetting projects at a sort of an evidential level, and then over time they become more effective at removing the bad apples.
Yes, no, it's a very interesting process, Chris, and you've got your own style there, which you first developed in Kosovo. So you also took the team in the Gambia to Kosovo, where you had previously worked for NATO and the UN. So can you share a bit about why you thought that was important for the Gambian team, and what did you guys learn there in the workshops?
Well, the first thing was to form a team. It was very important to me that I was part of a team of Gambians that could help implement the projects. There's an importance on local ownership. One of the popular reasons for a failed SSR process is that you've not got the national ownership. But that's not the same as leadership. Sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where the country doesn't quite know how to lead the process at a tactical level. They may know how to lead the process politically, and to design the grand strategy. But when it comes to the implementation, they may not know enough about the sorts of good practice that they're heading towards. Sometimes they will. Sometimes you can coach a leader to run the process. Sometimes it's more appropriate that, an international temporarily leads the process with a team and that they create the leaders to then take over the process. But these are two different things. Leadership and ownership are two separate things. And for me, it was very important that I had a team of future leaders that I could coach quickly as possible to take full ownership and full leadership of the projects. So I formed this multi-agency team. The National Security Advisor was the chair of the team, and my job was to steward the process and act as a coach and a mentor, a trainer, facilitator, you can call it different things, and to sort of, steward the overall process. So I decided to take them to Kosovo as partly a team building activity, but also because I wanted them to see a country that had already made their way down this road of SSR quite successfully. And there are many similarities between Gambia and Kosovo. They're both 90% Muslim. They have the same population. They are both very tolerant, open countries with a great sense of togetherness. And they've also gone through a similar SSR process, albeit with differences. But in terms of now, the amount of resources that are available to the security sector, quite limited in Kosovo. The situation in Gambia, similar. So there are comparisons and differences. But my instinct, having spoken to the Gambians and the Kosovars, was that there could be a marriage that would take place. And that also it would be a good venue to provide them with training. And of course, we have the vetting officers in Kosovo who can speak through the history and their experience of operationalising the vetting under their own conditions with their own resources. When I was doing it, it was funded by NATO, and my staff were all NATO staff, and we were vetting Kosovars. But now the Kosovars are running it with their own budget, with their own staff. So I felt that they would have insights that would be useful to the Gambians that I couldn't offer. Kosovars themselves are wonderful consultants because they've been the recipient of, nearly 20 years of international consultancy from either the UN, NATO, or whatever. So they themselves understand how Australians think about security, how Brits think about security, how Americans think.
They've absorbed a lot.
Yeah, and they've got a very broad perspective. They understand that there's no one perfect way.
So it speaks to the importance of, as you said, local ownership. And, first you get international input and you make that transition, you make it your own, that makes it sustainable as a pillar of that country's security apparatus, for the long term. So, Chris, there's just so many interesting insights that we've gotten today in and out of into the psychology of vetting and of course some of this institution building and some of the cultural factors that play across the situation when we get involved in the security sector. I'd just like to ask, as I always ask all my guests, Chris, over your career, what do you think are some of the greatest lessons that you've learned you think people in policy ought to be really aware of?
Oh, wow. Well,
take it wherever you want. There's no limits on this one.
Well, I think I'm writing a book about that at the moment.
Oh, brilliant. Really? Oh, we'd love to dig into it next time. When is that coming out?
I'm not sure. It's work in progress, but it's it'll be called The Utility of Thought.
Cool.
And it will be based upon my experience of what works and what doesn't work and perhaps where we can do better. But especially putting an emphasis on thinking about security and how different sorts of things can create constraints and lead to human and institutional failure. But to answer your question, which if I focus it for my own benefit, and if I think of a new recruit coming into the security sector, or someone that's about to be deployed into a new position, say my position in the Gambia, what advice would I give them in a nutshell? I would say allow time to learn, to study, to think, to research the job. Listen to others. Try and gather different perspectives about the thing that you're about to become responsible for. Seek out as many different perspectives as possible. Reflect on lessons, if you can, from the past of human and institutional success and failure. Usually it's easier to find lessons of failure. Allow the team around you to teach you. I think one of the greatest flaws that holds people back is the worry of exposing what they don't know.
Sure.
And actually it's a great strength to be honest about what you don't know, or if you're unsure. Allow the team around you to teach you and to coach you and to mentor you. And don't be afraid of saying, I don't know, or I need to learn more. We don't all have to be the expert straight away. But eventually, at some point, you're going to need to be confident about your decision.
Okay.
You should be open-minded. You should research. You should think. You should analyze. You should challenge yourself. But at some point, you've got to follow a decision. And once that happens, you need to be confident with that decision and stick with it. And unfortunately, the nature of, I think fortunately, but an external observer may see it as an unfortunate reality, that work in the security community is by nature unpredictable. The security environment is changing all the time. And the people that we are trying to address as security threats, whether they're a terrorist or an organised criminal or whatever, they will employ as best as they can effort to distract us, to deter us, to confuse us, to disguise what they're doing. And that makes the job of analysis very difficult. And we need to be quite good at hypothesis building, because sometimes you simply won't have a perfect picture or the facts in which to build. And most people don't enjoy working with such high levels of uncertainty. And it can be, sort of a diminishing factor on your confidence if you're not certain about the thing that you're doing. If you aren't certain that at the end of the day you've done a good job, you want to be able to come in and tick that box and go home knowing that you've done all the right things. Well, it isn't always like that in the security sector. So you need to learn to become confident with uncertainty.
That must be very difficult.
And I think, as a final word on that, find mentors. Find people who have been through this before and turn them into mentors. And it can be useful if they're people that aren't immediately in your team, They might even belong to another organisation. They might be retired. I have a few people that mentor me, and there's been one as I've worked through the Gambia who's a retired British soldier, and being able to talk to him in a less serious or a less professional sort of context can help you change perspective. And also, he's a very experienced individual who's worked all around the world. He's managed many projects like this. And he's also had the benefit of being retired for some years and being able to reflect on all of this. So he's often proven to be a really critical source of advice to me. Small things that might tune you left or right that could have a big impact on whether something works or not.
Yeah, no, there's some great points. I think the thing about getting confident or feeling confident in your own judgments in an environment of uncertainty, I think that's something very difficult for people in think tanks, especially, where emphasis on knowledge and being well read and knowing everything before you publish something is so critical often. So I can imagine there would be a steep learning curve for people who want to go into more of the operational end of things, or looking at real-time data as it's coming out in responding to a crisis. So I think that would be very particularly important for people in this field. And yeah, perhaps one way to do that is to seek out the advice of people who've been there before, have made it through, know what it's like to take on those daunting challenges, those daunting decisions, and to come out the other side. Mentors, as you say. Yes, no, that's given us a really brilliant overview there, Chris. There's so much to delve into next time, and as you've hinted at, I very much look forward to sharing with our listeners more of your work going forward. You're onto some very exciting projects, but where can people find you if our listeners want to find out more about your work, Chris?
Well, I would like them to look at the work that we've done in the Gambia.
Okay.
On YouTube, if you type in Project Trust Gambia, you'll find 3 or 4 videos that give an overview from my colleagues, from my Gambian team. You'll meet my friends. And also, if you Google Project Trust, you'll find a few articles, and we've been mentioned in a number of different documents. And then more broadly, if you're interested in my career and my background, just type in Chris Jagger Intelligence and you'll find all sorts of things. I hope that most of you have got more interesting lives would be necessary to spend researching me.
No, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting tales we could dig up there. As you hinted at earlier, there is a whole another part of your career that we haven't really delved into today, Chris, but we can certainly look at that next time. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving us your insights, and we look forward to bringing you on the show again next time.
Thank you, Liam.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to help the show, leaving us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts is the easiest way to do so. Thank you to Jimmy Balls for leaving a review this week. To give us a review, just go to Policy People on Apple Podcasts and hit Write a Review. Thank you for listening and for supporting our show.